Welcome to today's compliance operations pitfalls and errors that can strip away your FFL, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as we usually phrase it. JC and JB here. Let me get the slideshow moving for you. All right, so if you probably heard it before, but we co-founders at FFL Consultants. JC and I have managed over 500 FFLs in our careers, big box retailer selling guns. We've been there, done that on just about everything, guns, from importing and licensing to accidental shootings, guns used in very serious crimes that we sold, and we've been deposed, and we've learned a lot over the years. So our specialty program right now is focused on supporting the National Shooting Sports Foundation members. That's where we spend a lot of our time. We've been working with the NSSF, and if you don't know who they are, they're the Firearms Industry Trade Association. Proud owners and managers of SHOT Show. If you've been to SHOT Show, you know it's a great experience every year. Hopefully we're back in Vegas next year for that. We spend a lot of time in front of FFLs across the country, teaching and training with the ATF. When we get FFLs together, we do regional training sessions. We've got our YouTube channel at FFL Consultants and our website. We'll tell you more about that stuff later. With your IOI, I mean, that's an ongoing, weekly or monthly process for you. And before I forget, let's remember that IOIs are not permanently stationed in an office, and they're not assigned, quote unquote, to your FFL. So just because you had, Chuck visit you last month for an inspection and said everything was great, it doesn't mean Chuck is going to show up in 2 years to do your next inspection. It could be a totally new or a veteran or transplanted or relocated IOI who may come in with a whole different, not different set of expectations and requirements, but a whole different method and approach to doing an inspection.
That's right.
And always realize that can occur. I've had too many FFLs call me and say, oh, I expected Bob to show up because he's always been our IOI. And maybe Bob retired, or Bob got reassigned that day, or had other things on his or her plate. So always be on guard that any new inspector can show up to do what they call a random inspection for you. So back to my compliance warning here. The forms 4473 are a dual verification process every time. If you're more than one person in a shop, and we have some home-based FFLs and some folks who are just the only person working maybe early morning at a small gun shop someplace, you may not have a second set of eyes to look at your 4473 when it's completed. But make sure someone at the end of the day, or maybe the person that comes in this afternoon, or definitely at the end of the week, before you file these very important documents that need to be retained for the life of the firearm, make sure somebody is looking over those forms again, because there is easily methods and best practices for correcting 4473s before they go in the file. You don't want to figure out there was an error on a 4473 when you pull that form someday for a trace request and realized it had the wrong date on it, or the expiration date in the ID didn't make sense to the date of the transfer. Make sure that's done before what we call archiving those forms for longevity. Go ahead, JC.
Yeah, the one thing I would tell you is this: you want to make life as easy as possible in that IOI when they show up. You want to make sure that you're organized. I mean, that's really the key. This is your initial interaction with that IOI. So you want to give them the confidence when they walk in the door that you are ready to go, that you've got all your documentation prepared, you're organized, etc. So make sure of that. I always tell my FFLs, you should get yourself a little 2-drawer filing cabinet that's on wheels. Put the trailing 12 months of 4473s in there if you're not storing them electronically, which the vast majority aren't. And your 4473s for the last 12 months go in one drawer. Your dealer canceled and your denied transactions go in the other drawer. That way you just roll that filing cabinet into whatever room they're going to be in, if at all possible. Obviously, it depends on the sheer amount of gun transactions you're doing. But you want to give them that confidence that set the tone right from the get-go.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that detail we talked about not only for the 4473, it flows over to your bound book. We talked a lot about that already. And utilize and put in place training guides and SOPs. Not, the majority of gun dealers out there today, even with 10 or 20 employees, do not have a standard operating procedure manual. Those materials are available. The resources are available. You get them from us, you edit them a little bit to your own environment, but having those tools and training programs in place for your employees, because you can be great at this. But once you start to expand or assign some of these verification or review duties to other folks, the wheels fall off the cart, as we say. And trying to catch up with all of those issues and errors later is a real headache. And we deal with folks that do that. Especially if you're going to be a new FFL, partner with somebody early on and say, hey, am I doing this right? Got any best practices? What tools are available? Because you want to do it right from the get-go. Inventory management was brought up this morning. Steve Asbro brought this up. He was talking more about your physical process being completed once a year. We tell everyone, every gun dealer, if you have more than 50 guns, you should be doing several inventories throughout the year. And then when we were running big box retailers, we did weekly gun counts. What is that? Well, it's very simple. You count how many firearms you have in stock. You go and touch them all. Just don't count the box. Look in the box, make sure the gun's there. Look in the cases. Maybe if you're a pawnbroker, you're looking at guns. You're opening up cases that customers may have brought guns in with, or maybe the case is here and it's empty, and you got to figure that out. But how many physical firearms do I have, including receivers, parts, and repairs? And how many open acquisitions do I have in my bound book? How many blanks do I have on a disposition side of my bound book? It's real easy. If I have 30 guns on the shelves and in cases, I should have 30 open acquisitions in my bound book. Hey, I'm good. There's my weekly count. Takes about half an hour to do each week. And very worthwhile. That way you don't get a year or several months down the road only to find out there's a firearm missing from inventory. And that is a real pain in the neck to go and backtrace to when the firearm came in, who handled it, where did it go, is it out for repair, did we resell it, is there a transfer someplace? We got to pick through all our transfers for 3 months and figure out if we sold that firearm. Let's look for a serial number. It could be a real hard experience for you. So inventory management is critical. More than one inventory a year. And yes, we do encounter FFLs that don't do any inventory throughout the year. They say they have a great process in place, only to find out that great process broke a long time ago and they thought they had a great process in place. Yep. And as Steve said this morning, we'll tell you all the time, it's a lot better if you find the error before the ATF inspector finds the error when they come in for a random inspection. Yep. Yep. Know and understand all your federal and state laws. We talked about that earlier with the FFL guidebook. Again, even if you don't download it, you should have that PDF stored on your computer, on your desktop. Make reference to that all the time. And the ATF website is fabulous for using the search function. If you got an issue or question, you can go to the ATF website, try to research it there, or just give us a call. Your first call is always free. And if you're an NSSF member, all your calls are always free with us. So,
yeah. And remember with the state laws too, if you're close to a border state, you have to, and you're selling firearms to individuals that are non-residents of your state, that you need to know the state laws of both your state and the state of residence of the transferee buyer. So make sure you're aware of that. I don't know how many times we run into that situation. So
that's the second most frequent call we get every week. We look at our calls weekly and decide what type of training materials or videos to do. And the number two, almost consistently is, I have someone from another state in my shop trying to buy a gun. Can I sell it to them? And yeah, you can spend an hour on the internet trying to figure out the state laws and interpretate statutes. But that's one thing we specialize in. You can always call us for those types of answers. We deal with this all the time. From Minnesota's turning into, in Illinois, are turning into states that are regulated like California almost, between NICS and CCW permits being exemptions or not exemptions, and high capacity magazine limits now, and AR restrictions, even by state and town. In some states and town in states like Washington, and you have these restrictions by law. As an FFL, you have to make sure you're abiding by the law in your state and the resident state of the transferee.
Yeah.
Sounds like a mouthful, but got to do it right so you don't get in trouble. Got another question, John?
Yeah, we've got a question here. So, is the multiple purchase form required for all types of firearms, or is it specifically limited to a certain type, such as someone who purchased 2 or more handguns? Or does it apply to someone that buys a handgun and then a rifle and then a shotgun as well? Well, it's kind of a two-part answer here. So first of all, if you're in a border state, and that's a border state of Mexico, you do have to fill it out for certain firearms. There's a separate form. It's the 3310.12, which is the multiple sale of rifles. And that pertains to anything over a 22 caliber. And that does count the 223, your typical MSR platforms, all the way up. So that's a multi-sale. There's a number of facets, dynamics of that, detachable magazine, things of that nature. Everyone else throughout the country, to include border states, anytime you sell 2 or more handguns to an individual within a 5-day period, you are required to fill out the 3310.4, which is the multiple sale of handgun or pistol form. So, if you need more clarification on that, reach out to us and we'll make sure that you're covered on that. But those are essentially the 2 instances. There's nothing required if a person buys a handgun and a rifle, or a handgun and a shotgun, or a rifle and shotgun. Just in those 2 scenarios, multiple handguns, multiple rifles, fitting those descriptions.
And those are 5, any 2 handguns purchased within any 5 consecutive business days. And I want to talk a little bit about this. Had this issue come up a couple weeks ago. We have a new licensee in Florida, and he's a manufacturer. And he's only open, it's a second business for him. So it's not a full-time business, and he's only open 1 day a week. Now maybe he's only open to the public 1 day a week, it's Mondays. But he's manufacturing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, not open to the public. And that's okay. He's not open for inspection. But here's what the problem is. If somebody comes into his place on Monday and purchases, he's a custom manufacturer. So if he transfers a gun on Monday to Bob, and then Bob comes in 3 weeks on a Monday and picks up another custom firearm that this FFL manufactured, he's still within 5 consecutive open business days to record that transaction. If it's let's call it a handgun in the state of Florida. So I said to him, why did you list your hours like that? He goes, well, I was only open on Monday. And the ATF, because then the ATF can show up only on Mondays. I said, okay, makes sense. But now you're subject to the multiple handgun purchase requirements for any 2 or more handguns purchased in over any 5 consecutive business days. It's not days of the week, it's not federal days, it's your business days. So keep in mind that when you're listing your hours. And for this guy, it's probably not going to turn into an issue, but it could turn into more paperwork for him and record keeping. The other one, John, was border states for the long gun 3310.12 form. That's just southern border states, am I correct? It's not Washington. It's not Washington. Okay.
Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California.
So it's not Washington State and Minnesota. It's not bordered to Canada. It's just the southern states. And the reason for that, JC?
Firearms trafficking.
Right.
That's right.
Everyone asks that question. Why do I have to do this? It alerts the ATF on a very timely daily basis if anyone is attempting to purchase multiple firearms for the purpose of illegal resale and/or trafficking. Critical that those forms get filled out same day and faxed or emailed to the appropriate ATF contact that's on the form. We find that error all the time at FFLs. People are thinking that they can wait till the end of the day, end of the week, or maybe tomorrow, or Susie comes in and fills these out, at the end of the week. For every form that's not filled out, it can and probably will result in a violation and be held against your license. So please be sure you're very tactful in how you execute that piece of it. Okay. All right. I guess we're still running through some of these, John. Double, triple check your forms every day. Back to my scenario.
Just have at least a double check in place. ways. I mean, if it just depends on how many guns you're processing and how many people you have on staff, etc. But a double check is a good process. A triple check if you're a real high volume. That's what's recommended.
JC, how about just a little more on willful negligence? Because we deal with this actually, unfortunately, when we get called in an emergency situation and there's lawyers involved and appeals and someone has a revocation notice that arrived from the ATF, accusing the FFL of willful negligence in their responsibilities as a dealer.
That's right. When you are supposed to know anyway, that when you apply for your FFL and you receive your FFL and go through that initial interview and inspection, you're reassuring the ATF that you're going to do everything by the book. You're going to follow the procedures. You understand how to reference information, etc. Don't start. And we've had one of these or a couple of these here recently, rather, where they say, well, I had a feeling that it wasn't right, but you know what? That's for the ATF to deal with, not for me. Incorrect. You are the last line of defense. You are the last line of public safety to ensure that that firearm is not transferred to somebody that it should not be transferred to. So don't take that attitude with this. You do not want to be caught up in willful negligence, because that turns into a lot bigger issue than just a warning or adverse action or revocation from the ATF. That turns into a liability situation. If you know better than to transfer a firearm to an individual, something doesn't feel right, it doesn't pass a sniff test, don't say, well, that's up to law enforcement, that's not up to me, because that's an incorrect mentality. It is up to you. You're the federal firearms licensee. We're the country, law enforcement, ATF, Department of Justice is relying on you to ensure those transactions are conducted properly.
Yeah.
So,
JC, this might be, it's not in the presentation, might be a great time just to mention, when can an FFL decide not to transfer, even if they get a proceed, when should they not transfer a firearm?
Anytime they have a gut feeling. You have every right to deny the sale of a firearm. There's nothing in law that says the individual standing in front of you doesn't give you a good gut feeling. You're concerned about the situation. You can certainly say, hey, listen, you know what? I don't feel good about this situation. I'm just not willing to transfer you a firearm and move on. You're within every right to deny a transaction. So don't think there's a law or regulation that says you have to transfer a firearm to somebody. You can pull that individual aside, be nice about it. Don't be confrontational. Just say, look, I don't know what you got going on. I don't feel good about this transaction. So I'm going to go ahead and deny you.
And by law,
they throw a fit.
Right. And how the law is written, again, you're licensed by the ATF to basically manage the gun transfers for the government. The government's relying on you to do this right, and hence the license. But the issue is, if you get into confrontation with those people, you are going to deny an otherwise proceeded transfer. Really, either had a CCW and the exemption's okay in your state, or you got to proceed on the next background check. The one thing we tell every gun dealer is, don't lie to the customer. Don't tell them they got denied. Don't tell them they got delayed, because there are ways they can go verify that. And that just complicates the denial, basically, your denial. They can appeal it. They can and find out that you were lying to them. That just turns ugly in social media. And the other big thing is, don't ever disclose. Don't fully, our recommendation, do not fully disclose your gut feeling for why you're turning down the transfer or refusing to complete the transfer. And some things might include the way they were talking to the girlfriend, while in your store, or what you overheard them say about what they're going to do after they get their gun, or maybe they smell like marijuana. We get that call all the time. Can I deny, in states where cannabis is now legalized, can I deny someone who smells like marijuana? You can deny a transfer for whatever reason whatsoever, and leave it as that, as long as you don't verbalize to them, your opinion. That turns ugly in so many different ways.
And since we touched on the marijuana thing, if they smell like marijuana, if they have paraphernalia hung around their neck like a pipe, etc., or they present their medical marijuana card, Those are all causes to deny the transaction. You shouldn't even have them complete the 4473. You should say, sorry, can't do it. You've acknowledged that you're a user of marijuana. The 4473 specifically states you can't do that. I'm a federal firearms licensee, not a state firearms licensee, and you deny that sale right there and then. The marijuana deal, it's an aggravating issue to a lot of folks, but the bottom line is it's still illegal federally, so you cannot transfer a firearm that has either smells like it or has paraphernalia on it, or identifies themselves with a red card or some sort of marijuana identification card.
Yeah. And just a little more on that, if someone is drunk in front of you, they smell like alcohol, it would take the same approach to it. And then nowadays with the pandemic and depression, if you're qualifying your customer and it just doesn't sound right, feel right, you're not sure what they're going to do with that firearm after they leave, don't complete the transfer. Totally your option as a firearms dealer. So, good. All right, JC, our top form 4473 violations. Now, this might be a little different from what Steve portrayed this morning, but this is based on what we have seen most recently. It's the violations JC and I see on site inspections. So, JC, why don't you run with this one here?
Yeah, sure. The top violation. So the difference, I think, between what Steve presented today and what we're presenting here is the violations that the ATF posts annually. And those are the 10 violations in no particular order that they see across the entire country. So they really can't put a number one on anyone. And we're not going to try to do that either, because really a violation is a violation in the eyes of the ATF. So we would tell you this, that every box counts, where appropriate, a box. Now, certainly, obviously, certain boxes don't get populated when somebody is being sold a firearm, but, every box does count. So, and trust me, there are situations where every box will be completed. But probably the most important thing about the 4473, it's numbered for a reason. So start at number one, right? And we see this still today. And I think it's just kind of a behavior that's held over from the previous 4473. The firearm is supposed to go on the form first. If you look at 21A, it actually states to the transferee buyer, the person purchasing that firearm, the firearms listed on this form. I am the purchaser of the firearms listed on this form. So if there are no firearms listed, what are they certifying? So you really need to start at number one and make sure that firearm gets put on there. Don't wait until after you get a proceed or whatever the case may be, because you're going to forget. And it's required to put that form on there. Legibility is another big one, making sure that the ATF can read what's written. That's key. If there's a legibility issue, there are certain scenarios where you can help with that. There are certain scenarios where you should have the transferee buyer fix or correct whatever the errors are, etc. Invalid or expired IDs. This one really falls into a number of different categories. People accept weird things as supplemental documentation to prove residency. You got to make sure, number one, that an invalid identification or an expired identification, for the expired ID situation, it's really simple. Tell them to go get either A, another form of identification, B, in the case of the pandemic, make sure you have record that expired identifications were exempt for whatever period. That's come up quite a bit, that basically that period that expired IDs were allowed has ended in a lot of jurisdictions, so you want to be aware of that. But more so on an expired ID, tell them to go renew their identification and don't facilitate the renewal process. In certain states, it allows you to do license renewals online. I don't want you flipping your computer around and letting the customer do that. Tell them, look, you have to go get your license renewed. Come back and see us when you got it, renewed in the proper documentation. So the big one with invalid, though, is around the supplemental documentation, making sure you actually have government-issued supplemental documentation to prove residency. Next, denials and Brady dates, another big one. Folks that, the denied transaction, they proceed anyway, or the Brady date. They do it before the expiration of the Brady date, and that's 3 government business days. In certain scenarios, certain jurisdictions have much longer, and that has to do with local, municipal, or state code, where you have to wait a certain amount of time, but you've released the gun early. That's a big no-no. Missing NICS info or updates, not recording the NTN number, not waiting for a proceed in those states or those jurisdictions where you're required to, as well as recording the updated information. In other words, during that delay, during that waiting period, you get a response from NICS, but you don't record that information. I think it's 27D or E. Or you get a response from NICS after you've transferred the firearm and you don't record that information. So those are some big ones. Out-of-state transfers and restrictions, that's another huge one, where an FFL transfers a firearm to an out-of-state resident in person, and all of a sudden suddenly realizes that, oops, we're not allowed to transfer that firearm to that individual. That gun's not on that state's roster, or not permitted in that state or that jurisdiction. We just had one here recently where an FFL in a southern state transferred a firearm to an individual who was in the store in person, and they're an Illinois resident. And they utilized the Illinois FOID card, FOID, Firearms Owner Identification Card, as a NICS exemption document, and that is not the case. So we had to really go through a pretty intense process of having that firearm taken to an FFL, shipped back to the southern state, returned to that FFL, and then turn around and send that firearm back to the FFL in Illinois so they could go through the process of a background check all over again. So, and then on top of it, we had to go ahead and do a declaration of violations to the local ATF field division to let them know, hey, oops, we screwed up, but these are all the things that we did to fix our screw up. So it was a pretty intense process, and it took a couple of weeks, and that's a pretty serious violation. So you want to make sure that you know the state laws relative to whoever you're transferring that firearm to, if they're an out-of-state resident. Missing signatures is a big one. I would tell you recertifications is probably even bigger if the transfer occurs after the original NICS transaction. Missing 3310.4s and 12s, that's another big one. We see probably a lot more missing 3310.4s just because those are required across the country. One error can equal multiple violations. So just because you have that one error and that error repeats itself over multiple 4473s, they are going to go ahead and ding you for each and every violation relative to that one error. So you need to be aware of that. So this can turn your report of violations into a lengthy document. Missing firearms not reported. And that's kind of the inventory thing, right? You don't realize that firearms are missing until the IOI shows up for your inspection. You really don't want them finding the missing firearms, because that doesn't give them a very good feeling that you're conducting business properly. So those are just some of the more common things that we see. I will also tell you, one we didn't add in here is look out for date of birth. We see a lot of times that people put their date of birth for the certification date when the transferee buyer signs their certification. For whatever reason, they place the date of birth in that box, or they place FFL employees or the responsible person, for some reason, inadvertently places the date of birth as the expiration date for the driver's license. So we see that one quite a bit. I've seen that one over my last few weeks of visits. I always see it and I'm like, why do people do this? I have no idea why they reference that box to the date of birth, but they do.
I think, John, it's JC. I think it's when they are looking at that ID.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's when they're dealing with multiple customers at the gun counter too. You got 2 or 3 transfers going at the same time, and you look at the computer and you look at the phones and the IDs. So the bottom line is slow down, do it right the first time, and as JC says, every box counts, right? Just the last thing on the missing firearms. Don't ever be afraid to report to the ATF that a firearm is missing from your inventory, from your count. It's better to report it missing today and then alert them to it tomorrow if you found it. Not reporting a firearm is a very, very bad, jeopardizes your license obligations. And again, you want to make sure the firearm is reported in case it is found in the hands of someone who shouldn't have it. It's all about public safety, and the ATF understands that. So if you're doing a count and you can't find a gun, don't wait 2 or 3 or 4 days to report it. Exhaust your efforts, give us a call, see if you missed something, and get that gun reported. And again, it's easy to correct that once you find it, if you find it. Okay. All right. All right. Top bound book violations. I'll just run through this fast. Again, we've talked a lot about the manufacturer and importer information. Steve did also this morning. This is probably the number one issue I find in the bound book or the A&D book, A&D log documentation. For whatever reason, this ruling has been put out there many, many times by the ATF. If the firearm has an importer, a manufacturer, and an importer, basically if it's from outside the country, you should have both, and they're marked on a firearm, you do need to list both in your A&D log, your bound book, and then that information flows right through to your ATF Form 4473. And the reason for that is that if that firearm's ever picked up at a crime scene or found for some reason it was lost or stolen and is found by law enforcement, they will use one or both of those identifiers to initiate their trace with the ATF. And the more information you have in your books from the get-go, the faster and easier it will be to complete that trace and use that as a piece of evidence in prosecuting a criminal case. So that is, for me, the one thing when I visit that FFLs have to go back and fix and repair before the ATF inspection that ensues. Serial numbers, God, they're all over the place. They're from very simple to very complicated. There's many manufacturers out there using very long and complex serial numbers on some imported firearms. Again, it could be that number relates to maybe the factory or the country and the processing plant, and then obviously the serial number for production. And the entire number is required. The entire identifying number is required in your A&D and bound book, right through to the 4473. Make sure the number is taken off of the firearm when you receive it from the vendor. Steve talked about manufacturers, dealers, and distributors often mixing up guns and boxes when they're shipping these firearms to you this morning. It's easy, and we do find this frequently, more now than ever, especially because of I want to say the quantity of firearms being shipped by dealers and distributors. So cross-reference, if you have a problem, it's easy. You contact the person or the FFL you received the firearm from. You try to correct the records. As a process, give us a call if you need help. But make sure you're taking all that information off the firearm itself. Never take the information just off a label on a box. Serial number spaces, you can't leave spaces or dashes out. A very general rule is that on firearms, correct me if I'm wrong on this, John, there's no O's or L's.
Believe it or not, it's very rare that I pick up an actual O versus a 0. So you just got to be cognizant of it. There are times when, believe it or not, for whatever reason, a company has used an O instead of a 0. So,
and the other issue is is it an I or is it a 1?
Yeah.
Okay, and most dealers we visit have magnifying glasses available just for that purpose. They have them in the receiving or shipping areas to make sure they're identifying the serial number as close as possible. You might have to call the FFL you got it from or the distributor to see what they had in their records. Okay. Legibility we talked a lot about. It's very good to go electronic. Speeds up the process, especially if you have a point of sale system that integrates your bound book or your A&D log. It makes the transfer process almost seamless and eradicates the human errors that otherwise we find. Staff training, detail. Find the best possible detail freak you have in your location to be in charge of this process of logging the A&D information, and then reviewing your 4473s. The timing of entries in and out is very specific timing on when you need to be putting that information, first of all, into your bound book, and whether or not that firearm came in with business paperwork, as we say, bills of lading, invoices, other descriptors, or if it was a used gun. Used guns have to be logged same day because there is no paperwork to refer to if in the event of a midnight burglary, that firearm gets stolen. The ATF needs to refer back to a document, a record that would otherwise have that information on there for what may have been missing from your or stolen from your store. So there's requirements on the firearms coming in, and then there's date requirements on processing when firearms are disposed of or sold out of your location. Make sure those dates are accurate and timely and within the guidelines. And then you've heard me say several times today, I tell FFLs, it's all about the trace. Your detail and your records should be finite enough to help law enforcement agencies prosecute that person or that individual in possession of a lost or stolen gun, right down to the detail, when you last had it, when you received it. There's no gaps in time, when you disposed of it, who you sold it to, at what address, what was the ID presented, the transfer dates are accurate. All of that detail comes into play whenever there's a criminal prosecution that takes place. And last year, I believe the number was over 500,000 traces done by the ATF. So lo and behold, you will be involved. You will have a gun trace at some point in your future. Will it be, soon or a year from now? Making sure all that paperwork's all detailed and correct makes it easy for the prosecution of any investigations. All right, JC, I think we got about 10 minutes left here.
Yep.
Okay.
So here's some of the ugly stuff, and we touched on this before, making sure you complete the form 4473 by the numbers. The background check doesn't get started when the customer picks out a gun and is filling out the 4473. The reason being is you do not want that individual to accidentally or intentionally self-identify as a prohibited person and you're running a background check. That's a big no-no. That's the reason why you wait for the individual to certify that all of their answers are true and correct to the best of their knowledge, and then you can move on to the next process. And those processes are very specific. You need to make sure, number one, they didn't self-identify as a prohibited person. Number two, that their identification matches the information they put on the 4473, and that their identification is valid. So there are all of these steps that have to occur before you even get to the number associated with conducting the background check. So I covered self-identified as a prohibited person. That's a big one. So out-of-state transfer is not compliant. So that basically that individual, you have to follow the rules in both states, the state you're in and the state they live in. So you want to make sure of that, and you want to give yourself time to check those laws. Obvious straw purchases, another big ugly one. I mean, if the individual is coming in and their behaviors are consistent with individuals who are conducting straw purchases, you don't want to get ahead of yourself and proceed with a transaction that you shouldn't. Transfers with expired IDs, it happens quite often. Transfers to next denied prohibited persons, right? That includes that self-identified prohibited person, but you conduct that transfer after somebody's been denied, it's gonna be a heck of a game trying to get that gun back. Lost forms, 4473s. You need to be making sure that you account for all form 4473s. And that means one of our recommendations to our FFLs is you go into the NICS platform and you print out your monthly summary of NICS checks. That'll give you an idea of how many NICS checks you've done and how many 4473s you have on file to ensure that you have everything you're supposed to have. We covered the bound book, extra guns, missing guns. You want to make sure that you're recording those accurately and timely. Because again, things get lost in the shuffle. So you want to make sure you can account for every firearm you have in inventory. And then missing or incorrect serial numbers listed. That's a big one. Make sure that you're accounting for spaces and dashes and all those things. Make sure you're actually looking at the firearm to make sure that serial number on the physical firearm is accurately recorded.
Yeah. And we call this the ugly stuff because, we also, JC and I are the crisis managers for the more than 10,000 members of the NSSF gun dealers. We deal with this every day. We monitor the media. We work with the ATF. We work with the reward programs that are supported by the NSSF for catching criminals, burglarizing gun dealers. But we also monitor all the media in cases where gun dealers are being prosecuted and arrested for being either criminally or civilly negligent. And a lot of what JC just talked about can lead to you as a gun dealer being held personally liable, either criminally or civilly. And as the lawyers, subscribe to our newsletter and watch our videos, you'll hear about all these horror stories. But it's fun being a gun dealer. We just don't want you to get anywhere near revocation or prosecution for doing something wrong. There's a couple gun dealers out there that are no longer manufacturers because of either the way they sold products or distributed their I want to say cheaper semi-automatics. The most recent case to non-licensed individuals, or the way they distributed them, or just the way they didn't check the records before they made transfers. So it definitely can impact you personally. It impacts your business. And, if we do it right, we stay out of the ATF crosshairs, and, inspections go well. But there's some things here listed that just don't make sense. You got to scratch your head. You got to say, does this stuff really happen?
Yes,
And our answer is yes. Very often we're on site doing a 4473 review because renewals, maybe their license is getting renewed soon. They expect a visit. They haven't had a visit in a couple of years. And we'll find some transfers to prohibited persons. And we're like, wait a minute, we got to get these guns back.
Yeah.
First of all, try to find those people a year or two later, and then try to get them to answer a phone, and then try to get a gun returned to you. And, it's a very difficult process. So we want you, again, do it right the first time and stay out of trouble, and have a good inspection. Can you elaborate on what a straw purchase is? JC, this is your training that you love so much. I'll let you take that one. Thank you, Steve.
Sure. It's really simple. Obviously a straw purchase is an individual purchasing a firearm for someone that is otherwise prohibited from owning a firearm. In other words, if you look at the front of the 4473 and all of those questions under 21, that's basically a prohibited person. That kind of spells it out for you without me going through each one of them. But atypically, what we see in those situations is the individual doesn't express a genuine interest in a firearm or genuine intent in purchasing a firearm. So genuine interest, think about you, think about your friends, think about people that are gun enthusiasts or even new gun owners. They're asking a lot of questions. They're inquisitive. They're interacting, engaging. They're not trying to avoid you. They're not on the phone having somebody coach them through the transaction. All of those different things are indications that you potentially have a straw purchase. And, there's a misnomer in the industry that, well, I can't ask them if they're a straw purchase. Yes, you can. You can absolutely ask them, and you can ask them in a very nice way. You can just simply say, hey, are you the person purchasing this firearm? Are you purchasing it for yourself? Who are you buying a gun for today? It's probably one of my favorite questions. Who are we buying a gun for today? If they say, I'm going to buy a gun for my husband, for my wife, for my girlfriend, whatever the case may be, ask them, okay, you're buying it with your money. They're not giving you any favors for it. They're not paying you back. They're not otherwise prohibited from buying a gun. Ask them those questions. And that'll get you out of that scenario more often than not.
And I say, remind them that if they buy a firearm for somebody other than themselves, other than a bona fide gift, it's subject to criminal prosecution and could be a felony and minimum 1 year in jail. And don't be afraid to get good at saying that. Scare the crap out of them before they make a major mistake for themselves and for you.
You have a responsibility to ensure that sale is, a true and correct sale.
Yeah. And after the fact, if you think you made a straw sale and just because it didn't feel good, you can always report that to your local ATF office. They're very interested in hearing that. They won't hold it against you, but they can collaborate with local law enforcement and figure out, what steps to take thereafter. So Or give us a call. We'll walk you through it. All right.